Pruning roses is one of those springtime tasks that entails a great deal of confusion. This is probably because there's so many different types of rose. When to prune roses is a subject of great debate. Many growers would suggest pruning when the forsythia is in flower. There are exceptions to this, of course. Ramblers and old garden varieties such as Alba and Moses that only bloom once, those types of roses need to be pruned after they finish blooming. Well, our forsythia is flowering, so let's get to pruning those roses. This is a hybrid tea rose called Oklahoma. It's our state flower, and this variety is fairly tolerant of a number of diseases like black spot, mildew, and rust. Now, before you start pruning, you want to make sure to disinfect your tools by rinsing them in a 10% bleach solution. This will just make sure that if there's any disease on it from pruning other plants, that you're going to go ahead and kill that. And make sure to do that when you go from one rose to another or one plant to another. Now, the first thing that we want to do with pruning roses is to remove all the dead wood. Hybrid teas we prune back really hard, and we tend to leave only about 3 to 5 canes. But in order to see which canes we're going to leave, we're going to start by getting rid of all this dead material. It seems pretty intense, the amount of material that we cut off of these roses, but they grow very prolifically. Now this one, there's a cane back here and the top looks pretty healthy, but the bottom isn't looking so good. And it's also crossing through, so I'm going to go ahead and cut that one out as well. And I need to get a smaller tool in there. Okay. Now that we have it a little bit more opened up, we can get a better idea of which canes we want to keep. Now, as I mentioned, we trim hybrids back really hard, leaving only about 3 to 5 canes. And as you can see, after I got rid of all that dead stuff, there's only 4 canes left. And we want the canes to grow so that the whole plant fills up. So I'm going to leave one kind of on each side of the plant. So I'm just going to go ahead and take out this center cane. And when you cut it, you want to take it back to the base, kind of how you would prune a tree. You want to take it as close down to the collar as you can. I'm going to go ahead and remove this small one. Now, after you've selected your canes, you're going to go and cut 1/2 to 2/3 of that length of the cane back. This one's rather short, so I'm just going to cut it about halfway. When you trim a rose, when you prune, you want to cut to just above a side-facing shoot. So I'm going to use this one right here because it's growing out away from the inside of the plant. And you want to cut about 1/4 inch above that at an angle that slopes away from the bud. So the water's going to drain that way. I'm going to go ahead and do that with all of our canes, these bigger ones. There's not a good bud. I would have liked to cut it down here, but this bud's growing in, so I'm going to go ahead and use that one. And again, we don't have a great outward bud. There's one down here, it's rather small. So I'm going to go ahead and cut it above there. And now our hybrid tea rose is ready for some vigorous new growth this spring. Pruning shrub roses and climbing roses is a little bit different than tea roses. With climbers, we typically don't need to remove a lot of the material, and just the dead growth, or you can shape them up a little to keep them in the area where you want them. With shrub rose, we're typically interested in shaping the plant and also opening up the center to improve the air circulation. Now, a good rule of thumb when you're pruning shrub roses is to remove 1/3 of the oldest material. It can be a little tricky getting inside these plants. I'm going to go ahead and cut this one out of my way since it's crossing over anyway. Crossing branches tend to rub against one another and can cause some damage, so it's not a bad idea to get those out. I'm going to go ahead and start by removing this really old branch in here. It's probably one of the oldest that we have. You want to cut as low as possible. Now I didn't cut all the way down because there's another branch in the way. And that actually opened up the inside quite a bit while getting rid of some of this old material. Now shrub roses flower on mature wood, so you need to leave a good amount of older growth so that you still get plenty of flowers. But when you're removing that 1/3 of the old wood, we want to replace it with younger growth. So what we're going to do is select about 1/3 of the youngest shoots to leave in place, and then go ahead and prune out the rest. Now some of the other goals when we're pruning is to remove any dead or dying material. That's the same for any rose. And you could identify that by sort of a darker coloration. This one's not too bad. There's a bit of green on here. I'm going to move over to another stem. You could see the tip of it's dying back. And I'm just going to go ahead and cut this one down to a bud, right above a bud. And remember, you want to cut at an angle away from the bud. There's a little bit more dead material in here, and I'm going to cut that back above the bud. Now, a lot of times we leave the seed heads on our shrub roses because they make nice food for the wildlife. But in the spring, you want to go ahead and remove that so we could get some new growth. So that's one of your basic cleanup pruning jobs as you're going through pruning your shrub roses. Here's another good example of some dead growth. See how it's a little bit darker compared to the green on the living tissue? And I'm going to cut that back 1/4 inch above the bud. Some of the other things that we are considering with this plant when we're pruning is that we're right along a walkway here. And so when people come by, this plant's growing out a bit far and it's starting to poke people. So I want to trim back some of the side branches. And again, like when we were pruning our tea roses, you want to go back to an outward facing bud so that the new growth grows out of the plant, not in. You never want to cut to a bud that's facing in. A good example would be here, down in here, or this. The new growth is just going to go right into the interior of the plant. So with this one, I'm going to cut it back to this bud, 1/4 inch above, sloping away. And the same thing down in here. Okay, I have a few more sticking out over the road that I will prune back. I'm going to take this whole thing down. Now sometimes when I'm talking about cutting back to a bud, you could just see a little tiny bit of a bud here, for example. It's okay on a rose to prune all the way back to something like that. It seems pretty small, but the plant will grow. That was a little shallow. The plant will grow back and come out from there. Well, we've done a nice job opening the inside of this plant up. Roses get a lot of foliar diseases, so you want good air circulation inside, which will help reduce that. The one thing I wasn't able to demonstrate is suckering. Some roses that are grafted will sucker pretty heavily from the rootstock. And to remove those, the best way is to dig into the soil and tear it off where it attaches to the root. Otherwise, you'll just get more suckers if you try to cut it off like at ground level.